Coming to you live, but not really. It is all pomp and no circumstance with Ryder Richards on LetUsThinkAboutIt.com, the amateur hour you should never tune into. Welcome back. This is Ryder Richards. We have now made it to step 69. Oh, yeah. So that means we have pulled a 180 and this podcaster's jaw is sore. Okay, so speaking of desire, or its inverse, whatever, today we're going to talk about mimetic desire, which is how your desire mimics other people's desires. Now, after reading a few articles on this and listening to a couple podcasts on it, I picked up a book by Luke Burgis called Wanting: The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life. And coincidentally, I was also reading Peter Thiel's 0 to 1 at the same time. Now, both of these guys are inspired by the thoughts of Rene Girard. Girard taught at Stanford for a little while, but he's primarily a French academic and autodidact, I think. But this is kind of a fun story, but he was told how he needed to teach classes on literature, but he hadn't read much of it. And so he started having to read these classic novels right before he was supposed to present them to his students, just barely staying ahead of the class. So he's reading them quickly with an eye for structure, which led him to discover that most characters in the stories, they can be quite similar. And they end up being introduced to a desire that they want to fulfill, which leads to just more wanting, competition, inevitable conflict, and tragedy. Now, the ramifications of what this means for people goes doubly for society, as it moves beyond sort of this basic personal wanting into a motivating cultural and social phenomenon and eventually an economic system. Now, mimetic desire explains why we are so competitive and violent. In times of divisiveness and discontent, this discontent of mimetic rivalry explains why people choose sides, even though there may not be much difference between the oppositional parties. And maybe the chooser doesn't even care for their side. They just don't want to see Roger win. Roger. So let's jump into it and see why we fight so hard for things that we desire, but we didn't even know they existed 6 months ago until Roger had one. Ugh. And now I need one because I deserve it too. Part 1. Mirroring. Memetic desire. To mimic something is to act like it, to behave as it behaves. Look to it for cues on how you should behave. Because from childhood, you don't really know how to behave until you watch someone else behave. And then you parody it until finally it can become a mask that you can put on, or a persona, right? This is your behavior. Of course, at some point you end up thinking this is you, but really, we're just all natural mimics. So it's interesting to consider at what point your external mimicry somehow becomes an internal set of neurosis or desires. I mean, when did you understand the motivations of the external acts that you were mimicking here? To make you fully what you are without mimicking it anymore. All of a sudden, these are your desires. Did mimicking the desires of others actually make them your motivations? And is that what it means to be a real person, an individual, right? Is when you internalize the desires of others, and these are your own desires, and then you can stand on your own as a desiring creature. Like, I don't know, I'm just talking here, because I have no idea how any of this happens, and I'm not a psychologist, right? But to want what somebody else wants is, in a certain term, mimesis, mimicry, memes. And this all comes from the Greek mimisthe, which is to imitate. Now, at some point in the next 2 or 3 episodes, I'm going to do a whole episode dedicated to camouflage and the tactics of mimicry. But for right now, that would sidetrack us, as I just did. Okay, never mind. Back to it. Okay. To want what the other wants, the same object or status, creates an amplification of desire and a blindness to options. If we learn how to behave by watching the actions of another, and we watch this person reach for, say, the television remote, and they don't want to give it up, well, then we find that the television remote is a certain kind of Lord of the Flies type of conch shell, right? This is the ability to wield power. The shell itself, like especially in the book Lord of the Flies, is meaningless, but it's a symbolic representation, and this is the symbol of the right to assert yourself, to have agency within the group. Now, somehow, we know as a child that even if we get a hold of the remote, we're not going to actually have the power of our mother or father, but we definitely all stole it from somebody at some point, right? Our parent or sibling or something, which creates a game of keep away, and it's a dominance battle. And usually when I would get punished for it, I would follow by me sulking around, and I don't even want to watch TV. It's really not even that I wanted the remote per se. It's what we want is the attention and control that somebody else wanted first, or they had first. And we mostly just wanted it to spite them, to upend the system. Now, we can rationalize out that we're pretty sure we wanted to watch something different on TV than they did. But, of course, like if I think back when I was a kid and I think about old school television, no matter what I turned on, I was mostly watching commercials that just made us want more stuff that we didn't need. So we wanted to control the desiring machine. This is crazy, right? Now, according to mimetic theory, how this cycle plays out is perhaps we have forgotten about the remote. We aren't even thinking about it. So we have no wanting or desire. We're just cruising through our day. But as soon as we see Roger's eyes cut towards that remote or his grimy hand reaching for it, well, it triggers in us this impulse to want that thing. Now, this could be the last cookie, right? This could be the girl or the guy at the dance that you want. This could be proclaiming ourselves more accomplished or more victimized than any other person. It really depends on the setting here. And as soon as they reach for it, well, all of a sudden it's what we want. This is a competitive impulse. And one thing we know about athletes is they visually fixate on a goal to achieve it, so the eyes might have the cue here. Now, there's a new episode on The Knowledge Project by Emily Balcetis, and it's all about goal setting and perceptual focus, and she talks about the perception gap. Now, this also ties into Dr. Andrew Huberman's podcast on hacking your biological functions. By staring intensely, you can actually increase your motivation and drive. So one way to consider this is that as somebody's eyes cut toward the remote or the girl or the trophy, we track their eyes, and it's almost like this is the last fruit on the savannah and we're going to starve without it, so we both rush towards it. Now, this might be considered a conditioned evolutionary response. If somebody else wants something, our survival might depend on us getting to it first. And as we know from focus, once the left side of your brain kicks in and your focus narrows, we no longer have the ability to perceive the wider world. The flashlight of our awareness goes from a wide beam to a laser. And of course, now that we desire that object, that person, or that status amongst our peers, we rush towards it, trying harder and harder to get it, only amplifying our desire to get it more and more. It's more focus. And if we don't get it, we're enraged, we're thwarted. And yet, maybe 10 minutes ago, we didn't even know we wanted the remote. We had never actually seen that girl before, and there was no way to know that we were about to end up playing the victim when we went to that party. Part 2. The Mediator. The most direct example of a third party introducing us to the thing that we desire might also be one of the earliest examples, because this is the serpent introducing Eve to the apple, or forbidden fruit, or fruit of hidden knowledge, or whatever, and who even knew if it was an apple? It might have been a kumquat, since this is episode 69. Now, this once normal fruit, it's somehow now been sexualized into a kumquat, and it becomes desirable. This is primarily because it is now made rare, special, or taboo. You should not do what you want, which makes you want it even more. Now, you might say that our contentment ends when we desire. And in possessing the taboo object, well, that ends up leading to our expulsion from the garden. Now, when you really start thinking about it, this is a strange logic, because once we desire something, we're actually forbidden to act upon it, which only amplifies our desire more, and in so doing, we end up with excessive desire. We can loop back to this later, but really, if you consider cybernetic theory in capitalism and the libidinal economy, well, all of this excess has to go somewhere, and it can either go back into the system or the system will explode. And of course, if you want to consider this psychologically, if we consider something like Freud or the Oedipal psychology of wanting that which you cannot have, well, your father ends up modeling for you that you cannot have your mother, from which, of course, you were originally expulsed, which is just weird and gross. And then, of course, if you want her, then you have to get expelled again, right? So this is weird. Anyway, now let's take a look at another mediator who introduces us to desire. This time, let's talk about Shakespeare, a little safer than Freud. Now, in Romeo and Juliet, the Capulets and Montagues are both houses of dignity. They're very much alike, and yet probably because of this, they despise each other. Now, this is another key of mimetic desire. You tend to compete with those who are most similar to you. So Mercutio and Benvolio, they help their boy Romeo get over another girl by sneaking him into the Capulets' party. After which, he spies Juliet, and instantly infatuation engulfs him and her. As Juliet says, "My only love sprung from my only hate, blah blah blah, blah blah blah, that I must love a loathed enemy." The unattainability creates that rose that smells as sweet. And the sweet sorrow of parting is the fire of desire. And we become blind by our amplified desire and fixation upon this object, person, or status. Our desire and focus empower each other, creating a feedback loop of more focus, hence more desire. So Romeo was not blatantly introduced by a person to Juliet. Instead, he was introduced by the model of the city itself. The society made her unattainable to him. And this is key because no one expected or saw the city as the mediator. The serpent is actually too easy to blame in his temptations, but the hidden model that creates our desire means we really can never see our own folly coming.
Part 3. Memetic Acceleration.
Mimesis tends towards confrontational violence. So, as a rehash, if we take some of the lessons from cybernetic theory, primarily that there are energies within a system that have to be stabilized, lest the system explode or implode, then what we're trying to do is steer a steady course reacting to variables as they arise. Now, accelerationism, which we covered in the last 2 episodes, says that amplifying some of those desires, surplus or excess desires, that we end up producing, it's a means to break out of the deadlock of capitalism. There's excess energy there that can be used. Okay, so as our desire is amplified, this is energy in the system winding up. And if we do not check it or tamp it down, or if we don't steer clear of our impulses, if we accelerate it, there's liable to be an explosion. This is Cain and Abel fighting for God's attention, or 2 brothers fighting over the remote control. 2 grown men may be fighting over who has the best mullet, or 2 political parties clashing in the streets. This wind-up happens step by step. So as Roger reaches for the remote, I react and reach almost instantaneously. And as our hands collide, the remote is forgotten and fisticuffs ensue. Now, all of our focus, all of who we are, is now embodied in winning. The object, well, it may still be important, but it's really only a proxy for winning, which is what we truly desire in this silly, stupid moment where we can no longer see the bigger picture because we want dominance. This is how mimesis creates confrontational violence. Remember, we didn't even want that hair gel, shampoo, or that espresso machine, or maybe even our ex-girlfriend back, until somebody else modeled wanting it for us, or wanting her after we dumped her. We saw them seeing, and our model of having what others want launches us into desiring motion to possess the object. Now, if you amp this up a notch, that hidden modeling mechanism means our entire society goes to war, supposedly for peace, or maybe it's for Helen of Troy, but really it's a modeled mechanism of persuasion to want to be either the right type of person or to crush the wrong type of person. And it's probably both. Capitalism, in terms of cybernetic systems theory, reterritorializes the positive energies, as we've covered before. Yet all of this flexing, all this dominance in wanting what somebody else wanted, and in our desperate rush to get there first, there becomes a blindness or myopia, and we've talked about it a little bit, but along the way, we end up shedding a lot of who we are, a lot of morals in our pursuit of our desires. This is, of course, accelerationist, and in our focus, we generate excessive desires. These are positive energies. Not positive, of course, as in good that you are having them, but as in extra energies flooding the system, and it's like a heat that must be diffused or rerouted before meltdown. If the system is good enough, it will disperse them, and if the system is really, really good, Yeah, it's going to utilize these redispersed energies to power itself. Yet when the energy is too excessive, first from Cain and Abel, right, and then Crips and the Bloods, and then all the world wars, violent death is the result. So back to Shakespeare, Tybalt in Romeo and Juliet. He stirs up the energies of Mercutio by insulting Romeo. This is odd, right? Because this is not his fight, but he wants justice for the insults to his friend, much as Tybalt wants justice for Romeo's insult of his family's dignity by crashing their party. Each side has a reputational honor, and this is captured in that opening line,
The house of dignity and honor.
and this reputation will not stand for besmirching. So people are fighting over an abstract principle. Now, the real object of desire is, of course, reputation here. The real problem is these two houses' similarity. Both lead each house to hate and to work to outdo the other. So they work to establish difference between each other, but they do it in a reverse style. 69. They do it by wanting the same thing, but mirroring each other.
Because if the Capulets get a moat, then the Montagues want boiling oil. If he gets a rooster, I get a cock, or spaniel.
No, so these excessive energies and these blind energies pumped into a silly kind of feud, it threatens the citywide explosion, which actually means that the prince comes in as a regulation valve, and he has to decapitate all of them if they screw up again. So the energies in this microsystem, this city, must be diffused lest the prince loses his control of the macro system. So you may begin to wonder here how capitalism fits into all this, but simply consider the war machine. Consider secrets and spies and bribes and the cost of all of this and security. And you can begin to see how these competitions create economies that thrive on discord, us-them differences. Now, our next episode is going to be about how, amongst all this violence, amid all this excess and surplus wanting, we balance the scales through scapegoating and sacrifice. Thank you all for sticking with me on this quick episode. This idea is really way more complex and interesting and faceted than what I got into here. But as a theory of societal modeling, it explains a lot of aspects that other models don't really account for. But of course, it can also be argued against. Either way, we're going to keep going on this for a little bit longer. Now, if you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a friend. And of course, let me know in the comments if you want to hear any more about this topic. And this was, once again, just a very summary approach. And of course, please like, rate, review, and share. Oh, yeah. And if you're liking this little series I'm going through right now, please consider subscribing to our newsletter at letusthinkaboutit.com. Or you can also help me out with a one-time $5 donation, or you can even sign up for monthly donations to really help support the show. This is Ryder Richards, wishing you happiness and safety.